Warning. This podcast contains material that may or may not be considered appropriate for the average Trumptopian household. Listen at your own risk to unauthorized and explicit reading. Disclaimer. All rights to literature referenced are retained by appropriate entities, and no infringement is intended. The reading of any and all literary materials referenced herein is done expressly for the altruistic purpose of genuinely facilitating the species-wide pineal gland activating, third eye opening, transcendent spiritual enlightenment of all of humanity. Any and all opinions expressed herein are exclusively those of the imaginary talk show host, the incorrigible Mr. Zeppo. And now, brace yourselves for unauthorized and explicit readings. Reading from page 180 of The Dancing Wu Li Masters, an overview of the new physics by Gary Zukov. The chapter is entitled General Nonsense. Einstein did not set out to prove anything about the nature of our minds. His interest was in physics. Let me take a step back. On the previous page, 179, the general theory of relativity shows us that our minds follow different rules than the real world does. A rational mind, based on the impressions that it receives from its limited perspective, forms structures which thereafter determine what it further will and will not accept freely. From that point on, regardless of how the real world actually operates, this rational mind, following its self-imposed rules, tries to superimpose on the real world its own version of what must be. This continues until, at long last, a beginner's mind cries out. Beginner's mind is a technical term from Zen Buddhism. This is not right. What must be is not happening. I have tried and tried to discover why this is so. I have stretched my imagination to the limit to preserve my belief in what, quote, must be. The breaking point has come. I now have no choice but to admit that the must I have believed in does not come from the real world, but from my own head. Now, that's Gary Zukov explaining to you what he interprets as the scientific process of reevaluating evidence and updating our mental models based on new evidence. I want to jump back to the section I started at, which is the next page over, and read from a footnote. Oh no, I want to finish the paragraph I actually started with. Quoting Einstein, "Our new idea," he wrote, "is simple: to build a physics valid for all coordinate systems." End quote. The fact that he did illustrate something of importance about the way that we structure our perceptions is indicative of an inevitable trend towards the merger of physics and psychology. Now, here's the footnote. Oh, I have to read the sentence that the footnote is attached to. The beginner's mind was Albert Einstein's. In terms of this process, the author... let me back up to give it a little bit of context. The narrative is not poetic hyperbole. It is a concise description of the major conclusion of the general theory of relativity and the means by which it was reached. This is referencing the quote I read earlier about not having any choice but to admit that the must that I have believed in does not come from the real world, but from my own mind. This is a cosmic universal realization that all human beings are capable of achieving, but that the system of oppression we live under strongly discourages us from achieving. So Gary Zukav goes on to say, it is a concise description of the major conclusion of the general theory of relativity and the means by which it was reached. The limited perspective is the perspective of our three-dimensional rationality and its view of one small part of the universe, the part into which we are born. The things that must be are the ideas of geometry, the rules governing straight lines, circles, triangles, etc. The beginner's mind was Albert Einstein's. The long-held belief was that these rules govern, without exception, the entirety of the universe. What Einstein's beginner's mind realized was that this is so only in our minds. Einstein discovered, and this is where the footnote anchor is, that is only in our minds. But I want to read the next paragraph for full context. Einstein discovered that certain laws of geometry are valid only in limited regions of space. This makes them useful since our experience physically is limited to a very small regions of space, like our solar system. However, as our experience expands, we encounter more and more difficulty in trying to superimpose those rules upon the entire expanse of the universe. Einstein was the first person to see that the geometric rules which apply to one small part of the universe as seen from the limited perspective of our physical apparatus are not actually universal. This freed him to behold the universe in a way that no person had seen it before. And what he saw was the content of the general theory of relativity. The footnote, because it helps wrap everything up here in terms of what I want to share. And then I'll ramble a bit about my personal thoughts here. The view presented here is not that geometry comes from the mind. There are many possible geometries, as Riemann and Lobachevsky, a pair of mathematicians, showed before Einstein. But the actual geometry that we have is determined by physics. For example, Euclid considered geometry to be closely related to experience. He defined congruence by moving triangles around in space, and he considered his parallel axiom to be not self-evident, i.e., not a product purely of the mind. The view presented here is that idealizations abstracted from experience, like Euclidean geometry, form a rigid structure, a construct, I'll interject, a structure of such durability that when subsequent sensory experience contradicts it, we question the validity of the sensory data rather than the validity of the idealization or the abstractions. Once such a set of idealized abstractions is erected or verified in the mind, we thereafter superimpose it upon all subsequent actual and projected sense data, upon the entire universe as we picture it according to this set of abstractions, whether or not it actually fits. Now, Einstein came to the understanding that we do this about the rules of science, that we explore and we discover And then we build a mental model. That mental model gains acceptance, and people go, oh, okay, we understand this now. And then, despite the fact that science and that generally life is about change and adapting to new circumstances and new information, and that, the scientific method is explicitly about questioning and verifying that which we presume to be accurate, we generally all fail to do that. Now, the important question is, in my humble opinion, is this issue, as identified by Gary Zukov using Einstein's realizations about physics and geometry, is that, quote, just human nature? Or is there something deeper going on? Now, human nature is, of course, about adapting. And once we make an adaptation and it works, we sort of rely on it, right? And then we sort of neglect it for as long as it works, and then we go, oh, it's not working anymore, we better update this thing. It's sort of how we generally treat our cars, except for the serious hardcore car nerds that love their car more than people. Most of us have a honeymoon phase, we form an attachment to our vehicles, and then gently neglect settles in. Right? We've all woken up one day and gone, fuck, my car's a mess. What have I done to it? It's like nothing overt. You just sort of let it keep getting worse. You kept pushing those oil changes further and further out. You took it to the car wash fewer times a year, etc. Now, is this trend, is this pattern just human nature, bunny ears, sarcasm quotes? Or are we this way because for thousands of years we have been conditioned to operate this way because it benefits the system of oppression? In my humble opinion, folks, it's a bit of both. Yes, this is one of the ways in which human nature operates. Once we've assessed a system and have determined that it is not a threat, we sort of tune it out, right? The neighborhood dog that might have intimidated us upon first meeting because it was aggressively barking at us, eventually we just get over it, or it gets used to us, or whatever, and we both sort of start ignoring each other. Once that dog sees you too many days in a row, it might stop barking at you, right? And you might stop caring that it barks at you. You might just get used to it. Now, not everybody's gonna, but what I'm saying is that it isn't exclusively one or the other. I'm always deeply concerned when someone dismisses a really unhealthy, toxic set of behaviors as, quote, just human nature. I don't know about you folks, but when I really, really set aside my ideological assumptions and look at nature, I don't see a lot of toxic shit. Except for, life defenses. Sure, there's animals that generate things that are toxic, but they're only toxic if you're trying to eat that thing, right? If you leave it alone, it's not toxic to the environment. Like, I don't see a tree that pollutes. You look around at nature and you don't see birds that over-harvest their region and create starvation in their population. I don't see the creatures and the phenomena of nature generating toxic waste. Humans, though, that's like our number one thing. We love toxic waste. We love toxic waste so much that we still smoke cigarettes, and I own up to my fact, I still struggle with trying to quit that shit. And I've been actively encouraging people to not smoke cigarettes for most of my adult life. Because as soon as I got hooked, I realized, oh shit, this is a problem. And I'm going to just rationalize my attempt to quit until I can't rationalize it anymore. And I consider myself lucky in that I'm self-aware enough to know that about myself. But I also realize that makes me a hypocrite, right? Like, I tell people that they shouldn't smoke, and I can't quite get to that point where I quit smoking. Why do we do that to ourselves? Why have we created an economic industry system, a system of economy, wherein most of the products, it turns out, are highly toxic? Like, have you seen in California, there was recently a really aggressive cancer warning proposition a few years ago. I think it was Prop 65. And now there's these Prop 65 warnings everywhere. Warning. The state of California recognizes that this product causes cancer. You can find that warning on sunglasses, on a bunch of other, like, otherwise benign sounding products that you normally, if they didn't have that warning, would not assume that they are categorically toxic. Now, cigarettes, booze, another example, alcohol. We love to get drunk. I went through my drinking phase. I was a lush, man. I was one of those people that was like proud to be able to brag about how much I drank until it ruined my life and forced me to really reevaluate why I was willing to ingest toxic waste into my body. Because that's what it is. I mean, categorically speaking, scientifically speaking, the reason we get drunk is because we've ingested toxic waste in our bodies. Like, whoa, that shit's toxic as fuck. If you keep consuming this, I might fall over dead. Tragically, though, at some point, our curiosity with the intoxicating effects of alcohol managed to find a balancing point where the toxicity was mitigated enough that it didn't kill us too quickly. And then we could rationalize enjoying the sensation of that warning system that we call getting drunk, because it was watered down enough that it wouldn't kill us tomorrow, right? It'll take 30 years for alcohol abuse to kill us, or whatever it is. Or it takes something bigger than that, a gnarly, accident that you get yourself into or whatever. But look around, it's not just that. From sunglasses to clothing, stuff is toxic. And even if it isn't immediately toxic to you as the consumer, the process by which we created these objects is toxic. So we come back to this exploration of Einstein's experience there. What is informative about that passage, what is important about that text, is that we can, in our own attempts to understand ourselves, come to the realization that we are projecting ideological constructs. And that if we want to be free, if we really believe in freedom, then we really have to reevaluate all of our ideological constructs. Because, as Einstein himself verified for us through science, they prevent ideological constructs, once they get locked into our heads, they prevent us from comprehending new information correctly. They even can prevent us from understanding old information correctly. For example, no baby born ever out of anybody's vagina comes out wanting to blow each other's heads off with guns. You ask 1-year-olds and 2-year-olds and 3-year-olds, and it isn't until they've been exposed to gun marketing, gun culture, gun thinking, gun talk, gun adoration, gun addiction, behavior in others around them that they begin to adopt that in their minds. And then later, by the time they're a quote-unquote full-grown adult, the ripe old age of 18, they're really locked in. And then trying to convince someone that guns are actually a really toxic, self-destructive product and that the industry behind it is profiteering on us butchering each other, people don't want to compute that. It was difficult for me, and I was never really truly a gun nut. I was never that level of enthusiasm, but I was bombarded with the same conditioning as everybody else. I like me some James Bond from a really early age. And shooting people was what every TV show was about. Except for the ones that were about making fun of people. It's a whole nother topic, right? Put a pin in that. But even our comedy, even the way in which we bring about laughter can be toxic. Is that really just human nature? Or has the ego corruption that engenders addiction to money and power and corruption, right? Like there's a vicious cycle. There's an addictive, vicious cycle of being addicted to garnishing more power, collecting more money. And what do we know about more? It's never enough, folks. When you got $20, you want 40. When you got $100, you want 1,000. When you got $1,000 in the bank, you want 300,000 in the bank. When you reach 300,000, you want 1,000,000. It never stops. More is never enough. And that in and of itself right there is the beginnings of toxicity. Like the problem with toxic masculinity, what is it? It comes from the biological imperative to procreate, which existed in an era before we invented the moral quandary of marriage, right? So we changed our society, we changed the rules from whatever they were back in our tribal days, in our rudimentary hunter-gatherer days, and we considered it improvement or progress, but we didn't take into account that these ideological constructs that we created just blocked out these biological imperatives and impulses, right? They didn't really heal them. They didn't really integrate them into a better, more healthier, more holistic behavior pattern. They just suppressed it and buried it. And that's toxic. When you suppress and bottle up anything, whether it's negative emotions or even positive emotions, there are people who bottle up their positive, upbeat emotions. That's not good. That ain't good for you. I humbly suggest to you, my dear friends, that the agenda, as I've often thrown around, is to create conflict. Why? Because that perpetuates the profiteering on all the toxicity. As long as we are not focused on healing ourselves at that spiritual level, then the system of oppression that we ourselves created as a human species can continue to oppress us. And there's no one else to blame but ourselves as a collective whole. And thus, I humbly propose to you, there's no one else that can save us as a collective whole other than us as a collective whole. So, once we wrap our brains around that new perception, that indeed the problems we face cannot be isolated, they cannot be limited to, that's those people's problems over there, right? Fukushima leaking is not a Japan exclusive problem. The island of trash in our oceans is not a problem exclusive to those who live in the Pacific Islands, right? Or who live on the beach shores that encounter its detritus as it travels around the ocean. It is a global, endemic, systemic problem. Most of our real problems are. If you're really busy working on an issue and that issue is really conveniently pinned onto and blamed to a specific group, then you're probably just advancing some ideological echo chamber bullshit. Let me leave you with this thought, friends. Yes, our human nature is to create mental models. That's exactly how we physically operate. We see the world with our eyeballs, and our eyeballs are not open, gaping holes into the back of our skull. Our eyeballs are transducers. They take in data, they convert it into a completely different form of information, transmit that to somewhere else in the body, and then, as part of one whole integrated system, our brain takes the data that our eyeballs translates into electricity and then reconstructs that as a hologram inside the brain. And as Einstein and Gary Zukav were trying to help us understand, that is helpful, but it's easily abused or easily becomes an obstacle to our own growth. It easily becomes any ideological construct, any idea of how things must be, can very quickly be turned into yet another tool of mental oppression, especially if it's anchored in an extremely inaccurate concept of what must be. The world does not actually have to be driven by economic profit. We've just pretended that that is a necessity for a really long time because we were told growing up that it is. That's just how the world works, kids. You got to have a job and make money, even if you hate that job and the money's never enough. But as I pointed out before, we made that up. That was not inherent in nature. That was not organically how things must have developed. It was just how they developed, and then we got comfortable and we were like, well, this is how they are, we can't be changing it. But that's a lie. We are lying to ourselves. We can radically and completely change everything about the way we organize our civic activities. But before we can do that, we have to understand the obstacles of mental constructs. We have to return to our beginner's mind, like Einstein did, and admit that that which we have believed should be, because someone told us it must be this way, it probably was wrong. And that if we set aside all those ideas of what should be, what must be, how things are supposed to be, if we set those constructs down, then we empower our ability we obstruct our own capacity to grow and heal and transform because we're busy clinging to these constructs, and as it's obviously successful in our current political climate, fighting with other people about the right way to people. That's what gets to me the most. It's really painful. It's really sad and depressing, frankly, to watch Americans hate other Americans because they aren't being Americans the right way. It really, really stinks. It sucks. It hurts. It's painful to watch human beings hate other human beings because they're not living up to some bullshit idea of what human beings should be, instead of being honestly, genuinely present and witnessing how things truly are. If we had spent the last 10,000 years developing those skills, developing the facility and the capacity to recognize ideological constructs for what they are, use them only where they are really useful and necessary, and then set them down without any ego struggle, we'd be in a much better place today if we'd been doing that for the last 10,000 years. If we'd been doing that since the Tower of Babel, we would be at a utopian, delightful place, I think. Now, utopian thinking is so easily dismissed by those who are convinced that the only way things could be is the way they are now. That's another ideology. Now, I can easily fall into the trap of believing in a utopian ideology, right? Of how things must be. But if I'm busy just believing in how things must be and not actually doing any of the work to manifest a better version of what is, that's the litmus test right there. That's the boundary. Are you just bitching and moaning and complaining that things are not what the ideal suggests they should be? Or are you doing the work required in order to personally grow and heal and transform your life into something better than it currently is? To put it in terms of our current political clusterfuck of bullshit, we don't need to make America great again. We need to make Americans comfortable with loving each other again. And you can't force that, right? You can only heal that. You can only heal yourself into being able to do that more. So I'll leave you with those thoughts, my friends. I know that's a lot. I always try to bridge huge gaps and bring a bunch of different ideas that don't seem like they belong together. My bottom line is this: we need to stop fighting and get busy healing. And I think that I try to bring other people's voices into, this conversation I'm having with you, and that's why I'm a fan of this particular segment of the Almost Daily Zencast, the unauthorized and explicit readings. I get to explore other people's ideas, so it isn't just me telling you what I think. And also, I want to hear from you guys, my friends. I've been doing this podcast on and off for almost 2 years now, and I have been very grateful for each and every single listener that either downloads the show or plays it on the Sprecher website or is receiving it through one of the other outlets. And I want to thank you guys for tuning in and listening. But I want to ask, where's the interaction, right? This is the internet. We're supposed to interact. You're supposed to comment and post questions, and you're not supposed to. I humbly hope you do. I humbly welcome you to do so. But if you don't, that's great, right? I got to live up to my own bullshit, or else what am I but yet another hypocrite? And here's the thing. I'll leave you with this. Show me a human being that isn't a hypocrite, and I'll show you an enlightened master that's just sort of still wearing the human being costume. I think we're all hypocrites. Not because hypocrisy is inherent in human nature. We are all hypocrites because the conditioning of our society encourages hypocrisy. And that's a hard pill to swallow, right? The communities that we love, the people that we look up to, they unknowingly, unwittingly passed on behavioral programming that encourages us to be greedy, to be self-oriented, to care more about our wants than other people's needs, to be more interested in how things should be than being willing and able to understand and comprehend things as they actually are. And the thing is, how things should be is, those ideas can be framed in almost any way, shape, or form. They might be based on real close and honest observation about human nature, but they might be straight up right out of someone's ass. You know? I get accused of peddling an ideology all the time. The closest thing to an ideological construct that I think I've created is the sentiment that we should sit down and relieve ourselves of the blockages, the filters, the biases, the hypocrisies, and the conditioning of our mental constructs, of our ideologies, right? If I have any kind of ideological construct, it's that we should get rid of our ideological constructs. Not get rid of them. Just like I always like to remind people, we can't kill our ego. That's a misconstruence of what is truly the calling. Because ego is a naturally occurring thing. It's just doing or caught up in being a very toxic antithesis to some another facet of our being, which is our spirit or our higher selves or our soul. All things need a mutually arising dichotomous polemic opposite in order to be clearly defined. So if we have a soul, then we must have a shadow, right? If we have a body of light, then we must have a body of darkness. At least observations seem to indicate that. See, look at, I said I would wrap things up, but I caught myself using conditioned language, right? If this, then that must be so. That's some sound logic. And in some places, that kind of logic is very applicable. If the sun is out, then flowers are, plants are actively using their chlorophyll. I mean, that's a logical thing that is accurate to what happens. If the sun is not out, then plants are not photosynthesizing because there's not enough sunlight. But to say that it must be so is the beginnings of the ego trap, right? Photosynthesis happens when sunlight is out, and that is a true statement. But to say that it must be so, to say that it can only be that way, is a limiting and it's an ideological construct that limits our ability to observe reality, because there are lots of plants, and plants, like every other life form, are constantly evolving. So our ideas of how plants must be, how other people must be, we have to either acknowledge that those rigid mental constructs are made up, or adopt a higher level of clarity in terms of observing things as they actually are, so that our mental models can be updated to be as accurate as they can possibly be. See, so when I say we got to abdicate our ideologies, we don't have to go through some painful, destructive process. We just have to be, it's all going to be difficult and challenging, and then all growth causes pain a little bit, right? Because in physical terms, you're literally ripping apart body tissues and reconstructing them. No pain, no gain, right? But we do not have to destroy each other's ideological constructs. We have to, just like we are not really supposed to kill our own ego. That's a misapplication or a misguided sense of a deeper understanding, which is that ego and spirit appear to be in conflict because they've been radically torn apart, because they've been rendered asunder, they've been separated. And was this some horrible, evil thing that was done? No, it was probably what had to happen in order to embody this material world the way it is embodied, the way it is made manifest. But that separation seems to be at the root of a lot of our pragmatic, practical problems. So we have to understand that separation with clarity, instead of just cram ideological opinions about why that separation is or what that separation represents. Right? Everybody is familiar with the organized religious trope that there is a war going on between good and evil. That thing that we call God is actively fighting and trying to destroy that thing which we call Satan. And we think we defined this paradigm because in nature, life consumes life. Everything that is alive is dependent on the consumption of the flesh of something else that is or once was, alive. Even plants. I've already done an episode about that, I think. I know I always piss off the vegetarians when I get to this, but plants, like all life, at the core, they are driven by consciousness, and there's plenty of emergent science that is indicating that is probably so. And we need to update our mental constructs about what we think plants are, right? Most people relegate plants to a low enough level that they might as well be inanimate objects, but they obviously are not. And, mind-blowing as it may be, they rely on other life to give itself up as food. They do. Whether they're, the obvious in-your-face example is the Venus flytrap. It's a carnivorous plant. It eats a living creature. While it's still alive, it traps it and destroys it and kills it, right? But all plants seek with their roots the deposits of nutrients left behind by other rotting vegetative matter, which is the flesh of the plant world, right? And the minerals and deposits of other nutritional compounds left behind by the decomposition of whatever the fuck died in that area. That's what plants eat. They don't eat rocks. So all life consumes life. And thus, we, in our evolutionary development, had a very confrontational relationship with whatever life forms out there that decided we would be their food source. And what we achieved was becoming the apex predator, but then we started making up a bunch of crazy nonsensical ideas about how that was always our destiny and how that is the way things should be, must be, and that we are here to rule over nature and to use it as we please. Right there. That's when we went from surviving in this world to being a cancer on this world. When we decided that it was our playground to shit in and do as we please. And what got us there? The compilation of inaccurate mental constructs that prevented us as a collective and as individuals from understanding reality as clearly as we possibly could have. As always, friends, I'm not here to tell you what to think. I'm just sharing with you my thoughts on these matters and then sending you lots of love and energy and hoping that you go investigate for yourselves.